Imagine waking up to headlines that a single decision made in Brussels, a city more often associated with waffles than global finance, has sent tremors through the world's biggest economies. This is not the plot of a political thriller, but a real possibility as the European Union edges closer to taking one of its boldest economic steps ever, imposing direct sanctions on two Chinese banks accused of helping Russia dodge some of the strictest trade restrictions in modern history. What might seem like a technical maneuver could actually set off a chain reaction, shaking the foundations of international commerce and potentially redrawing the global financial map for generations to come. Let's unravel this moment in detail and explore why it matters to you, wherever you live. The backdrop for this drama is the ongoing war in Ukraine, which has seen the European Union wage an economic campaign against Russia on a scale unseen since the Cold War. Since early 2022, the European Union has rolled out at least 17 robust sanction packages, targeting everything from Russian fossil fuels and pipelines to its biggest banks and high-tech exports. The aim? To starve Moscow's war machine, making it ever more expensive and ultimately unsustainable for Russia to continue its military operations. But here's the twist. Despite these sweeping sanctions, Russia's economy continues to function. In fact, according to some economic trackers, Russia's gross domestic product contracted less than expected in the first full year of sanctions, and its energy exports have found new buyers in Asia. How is this possible? The answer, to a large extent, lies in the ingenuity and resourcefulness of those determined to keep Russia plugged into the global economy, sometimes by bending the rules and sometimes by breaking them outright. Internal documents from the European Union paint a striking picture. An astonishing 80% of all attempts to bypass sanctions, what officials call circumvention, are traced back to routes involving China. Instead of shipments flowing through traditional Western banks, Russian companies and oligarchs have shifted to Chinese intermediaries, especially in provinces bordering Russia, where oversight is weaker and authorities may turn a blind eye. Financial transactions that once went through Paris or Frankfurt are now routed through Harbin or Suifenhe, names unfamiliar to most, but now central nodes in Russia's sanctions evasion playbook. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen recently made clear that the 18th package of sanctions is designed to close these very loopholes. Speaking at a press conference, she said, "We are tightening the screws once more. It's no longer just about targeting Russia. It's about targeting anyone who keeps the Russian war economy alive." The message is unmistakable. The European Union is prepared to extend its reach, even if that means targeting foreign banks that, until now, have operated with relative impunity. So, what are these new measures? While the names of the two Chinese banks are still under wraps, likely to avoid tipping them off before the sanctions are finalized, leaked documents suggest they are smaller regional institutions based near the Russia-China border. Their alleged role? Providing export financing, processing payments for sanctioned goods, and, in some cases, offering crypto asset services that allow Russian entities to move money outside the scrutinized global banking network. These banks have become the back doors of the sanctions regime, small enough to avoid attention, but crucial enough to be lifelines for Moscow's trade. This move would not be without precedent, but it would mark a dramatic escalation. The United States has previously imposed so-called secondary sanctions on banks in Iran, North Korea, and even Lebanon, effectively cutting them off from the Western financial system. But for the European Union to target Chinese banks is another order of magnitude. China is the world's second largest economy, and its financial system is deeply integrated with Europe's. Even small ripples can have outsized consequences. Experts are divided on how effective these measures might be. Alicia Garcia Herrero, senior fellow at the Bruegel think tank, captures the essence. Sanctions are a blunt instrument, but they are necessary to signal resolve. She points out that the threat of sanctions alone can sometimes be enough to change behavior, especially if smaller banks fear losing access to the lucrative European market. However, the risks are real. Alina Rybakova, deputy chief economist at the Institute of International Finance, issues a caution. Secondary sanctions are a powerful tool, but they need to be used carefully to avoid unintended consequences. The lesson of global finance is clear. When trust is lost, it rarely returns quickly. So, what could those unintended consequences look like? First, there's the threat of retaliation. China has already bristled at Western accusations that it is propping up Russia, insisting it is a neutral party in the Ukraine conflict. But Beijing has also become increasingly assertive in defending its economic interests. If the European Union moves against Chinese banks, China could respond with its own countermeasures, perhaps limiting trade with Europe, restricting critical exports like rare earth minerals, or making life difficult for European firms operating in China. Remember, European companies employ millions of people in China, and many of Europe's biggest brands, think Volkswagen, Siemens, or L'Oreal, rely on Chinese consumers for growth. A tit-for-tat spiral of sanctions and counter-sanctions would not just be bad news for multinational corporations. Ordinary citizens could feel the impact too. Supply chains that run from Shenzhen to Rotterdam could seize up, leading to shortages of everything from electronics to car parts. Prices for imported goods could spike, and European farmers might suddenly find their agricultural exports blocked at Chinese ports. For consumers, this could mean higher prices at the supermarket, longer waits for new gadgets, and even job losses in export-dependent industries. But the implications stretch even further. If China and Russia find themselves increasingly shut out of the Western-led financial system, they have strong incentives to accelerate the development of alternative networks. This is not just hypothetical. Over the past 2 years, both countries have poured billions of dollars into payment systems that bypass the SWIFT network, which has long been the backbone of international banking. China's cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS, has been quietly expanding. In 2023, CIPS processed transactions worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and its user base now spans over 100 countries. Meanwhile, Russia has developed its own system for transfer of financial messages, or SPFS, which has already been adopted by banks in more than a dozen countries. The two systems are not yet a viable replacement for SWIFT, but the direction is clear. The world of finance is fragmenting. As Agatha Desmarais, senior fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, explains, sanctions evasion is a cat-and-mouse game, and Russia is proving adept at finding new routes. Every time the West closes a loophole, Russia and its partners find another. There is a third, even more unpredictable variable: cryptocurrency. Digital assets like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and the rapidly growing stablecoin market are being used for cross-border payments that are harder to trace and regulate. Some Russian entities have reportedly shifted to crypto to pay for critical imports, and Chinese banks have experimented with blockchain-based settlement systems. While the scale is still small compared to traditional finance, the potential for growth is enormous. Experts warn that tightening the screws on banks could simply drive more activity into the shadows, making enforcement harder and increasing the risk of illicit finance. Let's pause to consider the broader historical context. Economic sanctions have been part of the global toolkit for centuries, from the British blockade of Napoleonic France to the American embargo against Cuba. But never before have sanctions been so extensive, globalized, and technologically sophisticated. In the past, sanctions often targeted entire countries. Today they can be laser-focused, singling out individual banks, companies, or even computer code. But the lesson of history is clear. The more tightly you squeeze, the more creative your adversaries become. For Russia, adaptation has become a necessity. Chris Weafer, founder of Macro Advisory, notes, Russia has shown remarkable resilience in adapting to sanctions. Since 2014, when the first restrictions were imposed after the annexation of Crimea, Russian authorities have built up foreign currency reserves, diversified their trade partners, and invested in domestic production. The result? While sanctions have made life harder, they have not collapsed the Russian economy. Some analysts even argue that the pressure has spurred innovation, especially in sectors like agriculture and energy. Still, there are limits to resilience. Michael Kaufman, director of Russia Studies at CNA, points out, sanctions alone will not change Russia's behavior, but they can raise the cost of aggression. In other words, while sanctions may not force a change in policy overnight, they do make it more expensive for Russia to sustain its war effort, and that, in itself, is a victory for those seeking to end the conflict. Looking ahead, the world faces a fork in the road. On one path, the European Union's bold move could succeed in closing loopholes and forcing all players, China included, to respect the rules of the global trading system. On the other, it could trigger a lasting split, with rival financial blocs emerging. Imagine a world where the dollar and euro dominate one sphere, while the yuan and ruble anchor another, with cryptocurrencies lurking in the shadows as a universal escape hatch. Trade between blocs could become more difficult, cross-border investments riskier, and the cost of doing business unpredictable. What does this mean for you, whether you are an investor, an entrepreneur, or simply someone who cares about the price of groceries? First, geopolitics matters more than ever. Investors will need to track not just market fundamentals, but also the shifting sands of international relations. Supply chain managers will have to diversify suppliers, hedge against political risks, and invest in resilience. Entrepreneurs exploring new markets will need to be creative, considering alternative payment systems, or even embracing decentralized finance as a hedge against disruption. For policymakers, the stakes are even higher. Jacob Kierkegaard at the Peterson Institute for International Economics emphasizes, the key to sanctions effectiveness is consistent enforcement. Lax enforcement can undermine even the most ambitious sanctions regime, while overreach can backfire by driving adversaries closer together. Policymakers will need to balance resolve with pragmatism, ensuring that sanctions remain a tool for peace, not a trigger for conflict. There's also a lesson here about adaptability. As the world fragments, organizations and individuals who diversify across suppliers, markets, currencies, and even digital assets will be best positioned to weather the storm. The era of just-in-time, single-source global trade is giving way to a new era of just-in-case planning. That means building redundancies, investing in local production, and staying nimble in the face of rapid change. To put it all into perspective, an internal European Union report estimates that China is responsible for as much as 80% of all sanctions circumvention aiding Russia. That is a truly staggering figure. Almost 4 out of every $5, euros, or rubles that slip through the sanctions net do so with Chinese assistance. This helps explain why European policymakers are prepared to take risks that, only a few years ago, would have seemed unthinkable. So, as you reflect on these developments, consider this. Are we witnessing the start of a deeper economic divide between East and West, or will the specter of mutual pain force all sides back to the negotiating table? Will the world settle into rival blocs, or find a new equilibrium where cooperation, however uneasy, remains possible? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that the global economy is headed for a lasting split, or is there still hope that diplomacy and common sense can prevail? For more insights into the fast-changing world of finance, technology, and geopolitics, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell icon for instant updates. Stay curious,